In 1979, Cadillac would introduce what would fast become the most successful Eldorado in its history. And the car would last from the 1979 through the 1985 model year. In some years, the sales of the Eldorado would top 70,000 units, a level that had not been seen in any of the previous Eldorados before this particular generation. And one of the things that I love about the 79 to 85 Eldorado is that it kind of modernizes a number of historical Cadillac cues and combines them in a package that was significantly more trim than the 1978 Eldorado. In fact, this 79 Eldorado was 20 inches shorter than the 78 Eldorado, almost 2 feet. And it weighed considerably less, but it still had that executive presence when you pulled into someone's driveway or into a parking lot. And it still, as I mentioned before, retained a number of historical Cadillac design cues, but did so with, I would say, a more modern flair. Namely, those Squircle-style wheel openings that were typical of Eldorados, the hood with the prow or kind of that raised center section, the egg crate-style grille, the fenders where the tops are higher than the adjoining section of the hood. And as we'll see when we rotate around to the side view as well as the rear three-quarter view, you have the very vertical-style C-pillar that was emblematic of Cadillac Eldorados for many years, and you also have the vertical tail lamp signature on this 79 Eldorado as well that just screamed Cadillac. And as we rotate to this passenger side front three-quarter view, you can see a number of other design cues on this Eldorado that were kind of carryover from previous generations, namely that transition of the A-pillar into the fender was very similar to the 1967 to 1970 Eldorado, where that A-pillar kind of had a little fillet at the bottom of it. It actually was supposed to be more pronounced at first until designers decided that it would have been too pronounced a design cue in order to share across the Tornado, Riviera, and Eldorado, and they made it a more muted style A-pillar such that one wouldn't recognize that the A-pillars and front glass were shared across all three of the Eldorado, Tornado, and Riviera. This particular model is also a Biarritz version, and the Biarritz version for 1979 had something that harkened back to the Eldorado Bromes of 1957 and 58, and that was that stainless steel style cap that came ahead of the quarter toupe vinyl top on the Biarritz models. That was something that, as I mentioned, those previous Eldorado Bromes have, and these Biarritz models were so successful. A very high percentage of Eldorados sold in 1979 to 1985 were Biarritz trims. And I think that people just really liked the look of that stainless steel cap and the fact that there wasn't the full vinyl roof, but there was kind of the quarter vinyl top. It was a bit of a compromise between designers who always hated vinyl tops and probably divisional management who liked them because not only could they charge more for the vinyl roof, but then they didn't have to finish the metal seam between the quarter and the roof underneath the padded vinyl top. So the car divisions were often able to charge a significant amount for the vinyl top when in reality they were saving at least a material amount of cost because you didn't have to finish that seam between the quarter and the roof panel. And this Eldorado is fashioned in a beautiful color combination of black on red. The red leather interior, we'll see it in a second. And somebody got quite a few different options. In addition to the Biarritz trim, they got the alloy wheels, which were quite distinctive for 1979. And in 1979, the wire wheel covers, the fake wire wheel covers, just kind of looked funny. They had this pretty large center hub, and they protruded out quite far. They were redesigned not that long thereafter to have a much more, let's say, blunted center section that didn't stick out as far. And as we transition to the side profile, one other amazing thing about the Eldorado during these years was that it actually was probably a cost savings move for Cadillac to move to this generation, not only because there was significantly less sheet metal and weight, but also because the Eldorado now started sharing components with the Seville. The 1976 to 1979 Seville rode atop a stretched Chevrolet Nova chassis, and while it sounds like that was a relatively cheap way to build a Cadillac, and it was to some degree. Cadillac really did add a lot of content and equipment to help that Seville drive really well, and it was very effective. If you've driven one of those, they don't drive like they came from a Chevy Nova underpinning. In any case, the Eldorado here shared numerous components with the soon-to-be-introduced 1980 Seville, including the front windshield, the A-pillars, and believe it or not, the hood is shared between both vehicles. What an ingenious way that designers came up with a way to use the same hood on both cars. They did try for a number of years to disguise the fact that the hoods were the same by putting a big cap over top of the grille on the Seville to try to make it look visually different. But nobody even noticed, or frankly, I think cared, because the cars otherwise look so different, largely because the Seville had such a different rear end with the bustle back. Now, as we rotate around to the rear three-quarter view on the driver's side, we see one of the, I think, most handsome angles of this car, because you not only can see this beautiful tapered rear with the vertical lamp signature that just screams all Cadillac, but you get kind of a full view of the belt line and how it comes off of the front of the fender, that upper edge of the fender transitions into the belt, and then the belt line has this beautiful kick up around the rear quarter glass, and then that sets the deck lid relatively high, and from that point it kind of tapers down to a little bit of a point. The sweep up in the belt there helps pinch the rear backlight and make it look smaller, giving this, I'll call it kind of an air of privacy to the individuals in the rear seat. And that was a cue from historic coach building days, that very vertical style C-pillar that here even becomes more intimate because of the design treatment that I just mentioned. I think one of the great things about the 79 to 85 Seville is that because the car got smaller, designers perhaps used more restraint when it came to the surfacing on the body sides as well as the hood and the deck lid. If you take a look and contrast the surfacing on this car with the 67 to 70, I mean, it's just night and day. The 67 to 70 has, this deep kind of sculptural sides. And here you have just very smooth, I won't call it fuselage-esque, maybe to some degree it is, especially when you compare it with the 1978 Eldorado, the second-gen front-wheel drive Eldorado, or the 67 to 70. But it's just very clean body sides, not much in the way of creases that are running down it. You, of course, have the little deck lid crease in the middle. I mentioned the prow and the hood in the front, and that came with a couple accompanying creases. There are 3 creases on the hood, the one in the center, and then one on either side past that point. And you know what? It works. There's just less real estate on the car, so you got to kind of use a restrained hand in order to get the styling to look correct. And I think designers did that with this particular model. Now, as we transition to the interior, this is a little less modern than the exterior, but still a very handsome interior. The faux burl walnut here is not going to convince anybody that it's real, but it does look tasteful, but everything is framed with these kind of picture frame-like style, adornments and treatments. In 1984, they would black out the bright work around the picture frames, I think to just try to help give the dash a little bit better continuity. But nonetheless, I think it's still a handsome dashboard, and I like the deeply hooded section here to the instrument panel. One thing you'll note is the relative symmetry between the driver's side and the passenger side of the cluster. And that was because this car was admittedly produced and conceived in mind with export markets for sale. So if this were a right-hand drive export market, you just kind of reverse the dash and you can keep the center section the same. And there you go. Bob's your uncle, as they would say. In any case, one other interesting tidbit of information here, you'll notice that at the edges of the instrument panel hood, there are these caps, and those caps were actually made in different lengths in order to take up the slack between that and the top of the door panel. So I thought that was interesting, kind of a very 70s era American engineering way of helping to make your interior look good. And before we move on from this particular shot, take a look at all the Cadillac wreath and crest that you see on the floor mats, on the steering wheel. And wait, as we transition to the next shot, you'll see them on the seat backs, which you can see here. You can even see it on the rear reading lights for the rear passengers and on the side of the seat backs near the seat belt in this picture. So this was an area where Cadillac was going through and putting crests on everything. And, I kind of like it. You paid money for the car. You might as well be proud of it. I don't know why they really don't do that much today, although a lot of the Cadillacs today do have that V-shape theme to the interior, kind of similar to the aspect ratio of the crest. Back in this period of time, the crest had not been revised, and there still was the wreath, and hence I think you got a little bit of the look that you see here. And I would call the rear seat in these kind of a cozy place to be. Not a place where you'd want to take a long road trip, but decent place for short trips overall. And to be honest, the previous generation Eldorado wasn't much better in the back seat. In fact, one might even say it was a little bit tighter because the seats were so overstuffed in some of the generations of that previous Eldorado that just took away from the overall usable interior volume. This was also obviously the era of the button tufting everywhere, and that was something that you got when you got the Biarritz interior, is that you got a lot of button tufting. Interestingly, while you get the button tufting on the up-level Eldorado, on the Seville in later years, you would get the button tufting on the standard Seville as opposed to the Elegante. And here we have a center section of the dash, and one of the things that always interested me on the 79 Eldorado was this plug that just says Cadillac up at the top there. It looks like something was supposed to be there. And I surmise that perhaps this was designed before GM knew that it was going to be able to introduce these radios that had the clock integrated into them. And so perhaps that was a place for the clock. Later, it would be a location for a data readout for, as an example, fuel economy, and then that climate control that you see in this particular shot with the wheel, the thumb wheel that you turn, that would become a digital climate control as well. But I always just thought that where it said Cadillac up there was interesting. By the way, even when they transitioned to using that upper portion for a fuel readout on the gasoline-powered cars and the diesel cars, it still just said Cadillac because there was no computer in those, so you couldn't get all of the cool information that you could get if you had a gasoline-powered variant. Now, under hood in the 79 Eldorado is perhaps the best engine that you could get for the entire run, and that is the Oldsmobile Source 350 cubic inch V8 with electronic multi-port fuel injection. Made 170 horsepower. Now, in 1979, this would be the only year that you could get the Olds 350 in the federal states, in other words, outside of California. In 1980 and 81, you could get Cadillac's 368 cubic inch V8, but it actually made less horsepower, around 145 horsepower. So the Olds 350 that you see here was actually the best engine that you could get. And by the way, after 1981, beginning in 1982 and through the end of the run in 1985, all you could get was the good old HT 4100 V8, 4.1 liter Cadillac V8 that made 135 horsepower. But it also just didn't make much in the way of torque, about 200 pound-feet of torque. So the best Eldorados to get are the 1979 to 1981 models. Yes, the 1981 models are the V8 6.4 models that with the cylinder deactivation, but you can turn that off very easily, and then you just drive it as a regular 8-cylinder, and it's a very reliable Cadillac V8. But these Olds 350s are just so smooth. The Cadillac engines are too, in fairness to them. But it's just a great powertrain. Gives the car a little bit of zip, certainly much more than the cars had later with the other powertrains. Although I will say the HT 4100 that I have in my 84 Seville, I do get 26, 27 miles per gallon on the highway with it, which is actually pretty shocking for a relatively large car and 80s era technology. So that is one good thing. But I don't think the Cadillac buyer really cared all that much about fuel economy. They really cared more about the style and the prestige, and probably would have preferred to have the performance. Speaking of performance, these cars actually have a pretty nice ride and handling balance. They do have four-wheel disc brakes. They do have independent front and rear suspension. So they ride very, very nicely and very quietly. They're very refined vehicles, even by today's standards. Extremely quiet on the inside. I would say Lexus levels of quiet. So you're really not giving up much versus a modern car, aside from all that other Bluetooth crap and other electronics that are going to serve to distract you. In any case, what do you think of this 79 to 85 Eldorado? Certainly proved popular with customers. Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.